Welcome to Talkin Science, where we dive into the stories that are making headlines in the world of science and space. I'm Matt Miller. Dr. Brad Tucker is here. Brad, happy Tuesday.
How's it going?
Really good, my friend, really good. We're focusing on China today, so let's get the headlines in this, the 24th week of 2021. China launches 3 astronauts to spend 3 months in orbit. NASA seeks more money as China's space program ramps up. And China and Russia announced their moon-based plans to rival Artemis. Brad, very excited to be counting down the days to the Canberra road trip. We're driving inland and stopping in parks before continuing to the nation's capital to see you, Dr. Graham Walker, go behind the curtain at Tidbinbilla and learn about Questacon. It's a Talkin Science road trip for 2 weeks here on Trekzone from Monday. Looking forward to recording only the second show in person with you, Brad.
Yes, and hopefully it's not raining or terrible weather like we've been having a lot of lately down here. We haven't been getting much stargazing in.
It's going to be very interesting because we're planning to be in the car park at Mount Stromlo to actually, have something to look at. But if it is raining, the wet weather contingency is to be in your office there, and we might as well be on a video call.
Exactly, that's right.
Well, before we get into the show, a quick reminder of the socials. We can find you on Twitter at btucker22. I'm on Twitter at Merrimat86, and of course, Trekzone exclusively on Twitter. Plus, find our YouTube channel for the latest eps and on your podcast app of choice. You can get behind-the-scenes goss and early access to all Trekzone podcasts, including behind-the-scenes content on our Canberra road trip by becoming a member today. Click the join button on any Trekzone video, go to the Trekzone/support, or put your phone up to the QR code on screen throughout the show. Brad, first up in our headlines, Pam Melroy has been sworn into office as NASA's new deputy administrator.
We mentioned when she was being nominated for it, and obviously her ties back here to Australia. It was pretty unanimous in terms of her voting and then getting sworn in. So it's very exciting for her, and as others said, exciting for us here in Australia. What potential and opportunities she may help open up.
And Southern Launch have received approval for the construction of infrastructure to support their test launch campaign at Whalers Way in South Australia, with some strict conditions on them, Brad.
Yeah, look, obviously, we talked about when Southern Launch Alliance had their other launch from Kaniba, and they wanted that further south Whalers Way, which is pretty much getting as far south as they kind of can on continental Australia. Obviously, there's Tasmania. But yes, very not short leash, but very clear in what they can and cannot do as they test it. Being very careful in how these future launch sites here, and also there's talked about this in the Nolan Buoy with Equatorial Launch Australia, how do they integrate and not disturb or have as little impact as possible the land that they will be going on and the people and environment they will be launching from.
Well, Brad, we're focusing on China's space program today. Plenty to talk about. First, their 3-person crew lifted off last week to spend 3 months in orbit.
Yeah, look, we were highlighting when they were getting ready for this, and this is the third of 11 launches they essentially need to get their space station going. These 3 astronauts will spend about 3 months up there doing critical work. And they haven't had a launch with astronauts for about 5 years, essentially since their Tiangong test space stations were deorbited. So really have been ramping up to this big moment of getting more and more activity, human activity in particular, in space.
Now, they're going to inhabit the new Tianghe module, which was only very recently put up. I think it was back in April.
That's right. So it's only gone up, and then they had a second mission that went up with supplies and cargo, essentially to start retrofitting the inside of it and start getting it going. So this was really a critical part of them now getting those astronauts up there to start installing that work. So they'll be kind of following a lot of this playbook, so to speak, where they'll send up a module, send the stuff to actually go in it or partly go in it, and then send the crew to go up there and start working and retrofitting it. So they have at least 2 more crewed missions planned before the completion of their space station.
Now, this launch and mission are further demonstrations of China's growing confidence and capability in the space domain. But unlike missions to the International Space Station, which has been set up for 20 years now, the 3-person crew here will have their work cut out for them. They'll be working to bring the module into service. As you say, they've got the supplies, but they've got to put it all together. Big Meccano set.
Exactly. It's home DIY almost, if you want to imagine. But yeah, there is a lot of work that they have to do to get it ready. And, you can't just send this completed space station up, right? It has to be prepared. You actually have to send all these parts back. If you think about the International Space Station, it took a lot of missions between the US and Russia to get it up and just getting to that basic functionality. And then it was still a work of adding more parts and modules and all sorts of things. So it's not, they didn't say Rome was built in a day, neither is a space station.
Well, China says it's open to foreign involvement in its station. Interestingly, with the ISS precluding China, but this is primarily scientific experiments. This crew, in fact, looking to conduct cancer investigations that are led from Norway, and attached to the hull will be an Indian-developed telescopic spectrograph to study ultraviolet emissions coming from deep space. So interesting to hear that China's willing to entertain international missions as part of its station.
Yeah, it was kind of always the slight expected thing that they were going to have multiple countries potentially open it up. They get to dictate the rules, just as the US and Russia get to dictate who can go up or send equipment or experiments. So, it's always been a lot of questions about what does this mean for space? Well, would it have been better for China just to be involved in the International Space Station or not? And then you can look at it two ways. They get to decide what happens, but also they get to decide what happens, and that they can choose other countries to open it up to, or other people may be encouraged to participate who wouldn't necessarily always engage with the International Space Station now. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out over the coming decades.
Well, let's flash back to 2019, Brad, when then Vice President Mike Pence warned that China was going to try and seize the lunar strategic high ground and become a spacefaring nation. Bill Nelson, the new NASA administrator, has carried on the rhetoric, casting China as a very aggressive competitor that has big ambitions in space. He's looking to Congress for a massive funding boost to compete it.
Yeah, and look, this really does center around their activity around the moon. And onwards to Mars, even the show is a good example of just how much activity China is doing. It is not just NASA and Roscosmos and ESA anymore. They're doing it all, and they are pumping a lot of money in people, and that's great. Scientifically and for China, that is both great things. But also, what the point here from NASA is saying is that if they want to kind of keep the top spot, so to speak, or keep top dog and not just necessarily stay ahead of the game, but keep competitive, you don't rest on your laurels. And that means that they also have to have the relative funding to go with it. And this is, as you said, is interesting. This is an issue that is actually not a one side of the aisle in the U.S. Congress issue. Obviously, both the Republican and Democrat-led administrations and Congress are saying kind of the same thing, and that is, if we're going to be competitive in space, we have to invest more in it. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out in the coming budgets for NASA.
Well, some dispute the logic, though, with critics saying this plays right into China's hands. Let's not get too political, Brad, but the facts are clear. NASA's not looking to cooperate with China anytime soon, and they've even gone so far as to preclude them from the space station, as we've talked about. So based on that, and based on our need to have a competitor, do you think that's where China's filling this void that Russia was back in the 60s? And China's got to do their own thing if they're not being allowed to join the big players on space missions.
Yeah, and that's this is a very good point, right? China is not allowed to work with the U.S., so and it's the U.S. who is saying that. And whether that's the right decision or not, that's not the point. That is just what is happening now. So China either says, okay, we're not going to do space, or we have to do it ourselves. So there's really only two options there. There is either they don't do anything, or they have to do it themselves. And look, you can imagine this. let's go back to this. Imagine the International Space Station has been successful and as big as it is because the U.S. and Russia agreed to work together instead of doing their own things separately. Because there was Mir with the Russians, there was Skylab with the Americans. They could have just built newer versions. Because Tiangong 1 or the Tiangong Space Station, the new one that China's building, is smaller than the International Space Station. It is more similar to Mir. Imagine what that would have been if they could have been added to the International Space Station to boost it, to build it, to keep it updated, to do all those sorts of things. So, is it necessarily the best thing even for the U.S. to have a competitor versus to have a collaborator? And I think this is going to be an interesting thing to see how this narrative goes through. In the height of the Cold War in the 70s and 80s, there was things like the Soyuz Apollos missions where the U.S. and Russia worked together in space to do joint missions. So that required, for two things to dock in space means you essentially have to give up all of your secrets of how it works to the other, because otherwise it will crash, right? You can't just say, we're not going to tell you all this other stuff because it's not going to work. So, there's a sharing of information, data, and science in the 70s and 80s. So there almost is a framework to say, hey, look, they kept it civil, and it kind of worked up there. Maybe we should be thinking about this, as you said, not with a new competitor, but with a new way of thinking about space.
Yeah, exactly right. And to say that there's nothing on the horizon doesn't mean that the horizon can't change and something else might come along. As you say, the Cold War is a clear indication that things can happen despite political positioning and jostling.
Exactly. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this really plays out. Is it that they can use it to increase funding so there is more space because, as you said, they have that competitor or that competition? Or is it going to be ultimately they have to reevaluate? It's by no means, I think, an end deal in terms of how it's going to play out. It's going to be a bigger and bigger part of space, especially when you just add in the mix the private companies that are coming in. This space race is no longer just you have two sides. Lots of different people can enter at any one time, and we're seeing that now. So it may be advantageous to essentially have the U.S. not working with others, private companies or countries at that.
Well, part of this simmering space race is the revelation of China and Russia's joint effort to get a moon base built. Now, we knew about this. We knew that it was coming, but the details have been released in the last week. And one of the big announcements is that no astronauts or cosmonauts are going to be launched there for the next decade.
Yeah, this is exactly right. They kind of agreed to work together, as we talked about a few months ago, again, with similar issues we were just talking about of being locked out of China participating with the U.S. So it's really just what Russia decided to do. And so now there's a lot more detail, as you said, to it, really trying to ramp up the activity in the 2030s for human activity from China and Russia on the moon, spending the better part of the next decade with plans and surveyors and operation to get it ready. So, obviously things can change and things can plan out and look differently. But clearly what we will see is a very big effort from this collaboration to have activity on the moon. And again, how that fits in with the U.S. Time plans for Artemis. We talk about the U.S. getting back to the moon by 2024. Yes, that is not a moon base necessarily. We're talking about slowly ramping up human activity. So how Russia and China do it in terms of what their capabilities are, it is going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out.
Well, the International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS, will consist of a space station in lunar orbit, a base on the surface, and a set of mobile rovers and hopping robots. Very cool stuff.
Yeah, and not too dissimilar also from the U.S. thinking that you would have a space station around lunar orbit, you have some sort of base on the moon, and then you obviously have transportation on it. And so, yeah, it's a similar playbook, and you can see that it's not one group or the other copying each other. You can actually just see what the thinking of the space community is that you want to have a longer sustained presence in multiple ways around the moon, because the moon is really going to be this critical juncture for future missions. Because once these are all set up, then that's when everyone's going to be turning their attention to, well, how do we take that next big leap and really hit the ground running on Mars? So really see how this activity here and the infrastructure built here affects the Martian plans, again, of the US and Russia and China. And again, these private companies, we know SpaceX and Blue Origin is very interested in this as well. We talked about iSpace, the Japanese company building a lander for the moon for the Canadians and Europeans. So it's by no means, hey, there's just going to be one or few things happening in a short amount of time. It is going to be this huge ramp of activity like we've seen in the past 20 to 30 years around the Earth. Now it's going to be happening on the moon.
Well, a reconnaissance phase will begin this year. Within 4 years, they will have sites selected, with construction to then run from 2026 to 2035. And once the ILRS becomes operational, it'll provide a range of scientific facilities and equipment to study lunar topography, geomorphology and chemistry of the moon, as well as enabling space and Earth observations from the surface. So it's got quite a wide permit or a wide purview to be studying.
It is. And when you actually look at also the Artemis plans, even in these early missions, Artemis 1, there's been open calls for scientific payloads to go on it. You know, the Apollo and Russian missions to the moon in the 60s and 70s had a lot of science. And in fact, I think the basic success of them was the science we got out of it. And obviously all these groups are thinking about that this way. It's going to open up ideas that people thought would be 100 years down the road. I remember just 10 years ago, people talking about the potential of building a big radio telescope on the far side of the moon. It is the most radio quiet place in the universe, because essentially the Earth is the loudest place. But it means that we would be able to have the best radio observations. Everyone said, yeah, okay, fine. But no one really thought it was a real idea, because no one was going to the moon. That was going to be the critical spot. That is no longer the case. It may be in the next decade, it is just cheaper to build this stuff on the moon than try and put it around the Earth. And that's going to dramatically change the science that we can do in ways we really haven't even fully comprehended the scale of impact there.
And just before we go, Brad, a look ahead to this week's Talkin Science interview. Dr. Warwick Bowen led a team on a mission to create the world's first quantum microscope. They succeeded, meaning scientists will no longer have to risk their subject material with laser microscopy. Now, Professor, it's not like traditional microscopes at this stage, the ones where we get to look in them and look down at a plate. It's currently spread out all on a table like we can see here in this overlay. Will it ever get to a point where it'll resemble more like a traditional microscope, like the ones behind you?
It's not so far away from the state-of-the-art and precision microscopes now. So the kind of microscopes that you use to see down to the nanoscale or see very, very faint details inside cells, they involve these sorts of bright lasers that we're using, and often they'll be on a table much like the ones you see here. They're not like a microscope you see in school, but they're very powerful, useful microscopes. The big challenge really for us is that quantum entangled light is quite fragile, and you have to be careful when you use it. And that introduces a whole another set of requirements that quantum physicists like myself know how to handle and to deal with. But to make the microscope useful for biologists, we have to make that quantum entanglement user-friendly and robust. So that's really a major challenge for the broad usability of these sorts of microscopes.
Well, that interview will be out Thursday at 11:30 p.m. GMT, or if you're watching us in the future, click the card in the top right of the video. Follow the links to our website at Trekzone.org. Brad, the Canberra road trip kicks off next week. We're on air for 2 weeks from your stomping ground. Plenty of awesome content to come. We're going to have more details in Talkin Science next week. But I'm looking forward to catching up with you in person for only the second time in the show's history. I've said that a couple of times, but it's true. I can't believe it.
Yeah, that is right. It's one of those things, especially when you budgeted in last year, no one did anything. So yes, we'll welcome you with our great warm weather.
Awesome, Brad. Well, as always, it's great to pick apart the stories of the week with you, and I'll see you there at Mount Stromlo next week.
Keep up to date with Twitter Catch new podcasts daily on YouTube. Plus, we're beaming to your favorite podcast app 5 days a week. Just search for Trekzone and subscribe.